Today I'm going to be sharing 3 useful tips that can really help you out if you're using 808s in your beats. As you're making your beat, you have your loop down as well as a nice drum pattern to go along with it. Now it comes time to coming up with your 808 pattern, and I'm sure you're like me, you have a huge library of 808s that you like to go through as your beat's playing to figure out which one sounds best. And eventually you find one. It sounds like it has a good amount of distortion, you like the texture of the 808, and it sounds like it's going to fit perfectly in your beat. You come up with your pattern and then you hit play. But for some reason, no matter how hard you try, even if you try to raise the level, EQ it, distort the 808, you just can't get it to sound loud in your beat. It sounds like it has a nice punch to it, but it doesn't have that full body that you want out of your 808. Well, the reason might be the shape of the 808. You guys can see if I open it up and look at the 808 visually here. A lot of the 808s that you can download that are probably in your library right now have a similar shape to this, where it starts off really loud, and then tapers off pretty quickly and becomes quiet. And at this point you might end up getting frustrated because it sounds like the perfect 808, but you just can't get it loud enough. Well, here's a little trick that you guys can use if you find yourself in this situation. Step 1 is to hit normalize, and step 2 is to start playing around with the sample start dial right here, as well as the quick fade in dial right here. You guys can see what's starting to happen here. The 808 is completely changing shape as soon as I start playing around with these dials. I basically just made this 808 a lot thicker, fatter, and just more dense. So you guys can hear how this 808 sounds. Now you might need to listen to this one on your speakers to get the full effect here. And again, if we compare this to our old 808 here, our old 808 just does not sound as loud, even though the exact same settings are used for the volume and they're being routed to the exact same mixer channel. Our new 808 just sounds a lot more dense and thick. To explain what's happening here, if we take a look at the old 808 again, the in feature here basically acts as a fade into whatever sample that you have here. You guys can see if I use the in dial on a very consistent looking shape here, as soon as I start turning it up, the beginning of our sample becomes quiet and then it slowly fades in. So when I do this exact same thing on my 808, what I'm doing is taking the initial area of my 808 here, and I'm just making it a little bit more quiet. The idea here is that I don't want the slope of my 808 to be as extreme, I want it to be as flat as possible. After this, I'm going to use the sample start time to get rid of any excessive loud parts in the very beginning of my 808. Overall, what I want is this 808's volume to be as level and flat as possible so that once I normalize it, much more of the 808's volume is going to get brought up once I turn on normalization. For those that don't know what normalization is, it basically takes the loudest part of your sound and makes sure it's at maximum volume without clipping. It also boosts every other part of your sound equally as well. So if the beginning of the 808 is the loudest, normalizing it won't be as effective. But once I round out the shape a tiny bit and have it a little bit more even, now this 808 is going to be louder for longer and it's just going to sound a lot more thick. Next up, I want to show you guys some advanced sliding techniques that you might not know about. Typically with slides, you might be used to seeing something like this, where you have your initial note here, and then you use your slide note to get your 808 to slide to another note. But if you guys take a look at the pattern that I came up with here, we have a couple of things happening here with the 808 sliding that you might not be used to seeing. For one, sliding can be used with velocity as well, as you guys can see here. So if I have an 808 that starts off with a very low velocity like so, and I overlap it with a slide note that has a higher velocity, you guys can hear what's going to happen. We gain the ability to have the 808 start off at a low volume, and then by the time it reaches the end of our slide note right here, it's going to reach our new velocity that the slide note has, which is this one right here. So this is something that you can use whenever you have a section in your 808 pattern that has a lot of low end density, like a bass fill like I have at the end right here. In this very same section, you guys can see if I open up my kick pattern, I have 2 kick notes right here, which is playing at the exact same time as my 808 fill. And so there's going to be a lot going on in the low end of my beat in this section, so it might be a good idea to control the volume here. So to make sure that this section doesn't become too overwhelming with bass, what I did was I started off my 808 at a very low velocity, you guys can see right down here, and then I stacked this slide note right on top of it. You guys can see if I stretch this out, it's a slide note right here. So the 808 is going to start at a very low volume, which is going to allow the kick to actually cut through. And then I have all this room at the back end after the slide note for the actual 808 to cut through. So if you're someone that doesn't like to sidechain your 808s, but you still could use some sidechaining in certain sections of your beat, this is a very helpful tool that you can use. Or you could just use this function creatively. If you like the idea of a sliding, fading 808 in your beat, go ahead and use this. The other unique sliding technique that I'm using, you guys can see earlier on in the pattern, I have these two slides stacked on top of each other. This is something that I like to use whenever I want my 808 to sound a little bit more interesting and a little bit more unique. So as you guys know, whenever you have a slide note, what happens is we start to go to our new note once we reach the beginning of our slide note, which would be right here. And then our initial note, the G, is going to finally become an actual G sharp once we reach the end of the slide note, which is all the way over here. But if you stack a slide on top of another slide, what's going to happen is you're going to start to go towards the second slide note partway through the first one. And what happens is we get this cool pitch bend effect. To show you guys this visually, what's happening is that without these slide notes, we just have a straightforward G note here. But with these slide notes, we start off at a G, and then we slowly start to go towards a G sharp. Typically, we'd get to our G sharp right here, but once we hit our second slide note, we start to pitch down. And again, we would have an F sharp note once we get to this point here, but long before then, our 808 actually ends. And that's how you get that cool pitch bend in your 808. And this is especially useful if you have a pretty minimal beat that doesn't have a lot going on in it, and the 808 is a huge centerpiece, a huge focal point in the beat. Adding a small little detail, a little bit of character to your 808 like this is just going to go a long way in making the beat sound a little bit more interesting. So again, this is how this 808 would sound without the slide stack. And then once you add the slide stack on top, now how extreme you want this bend is going to depend on two things. Which notes you choose, so if we chose two notes that are pretty far apart, you guys can hear this pitch bend is going to be a lot more extreme. As well as the shorter that these slide notes are, the more extreme the pitch bend is going to be as well. Personally, I don't get too audacious with this technique. It's just something I like to use a little bit more subtly, but the choice is yours. Finally, tip number 3. This is something that I run into a lot and it ends up annoying me a ton. And eventually I was able to figure out a solution to this problem, which I'm going to share with you guys right now. But what happened to me again was I would be looking through my 808 library for a good 808 to use in my beat. And eventually I would find one that perfectly fits my beat. It has a nice texture to it and it fits right in. But the 808 is just way too long and I want a shorter, punchier type of 808. And as many of you know, what you do is go ahead and turn on the envelope function here just to control the shape of your sound. Now one thing to note, for some reason I see a lot of people make a perfect square shape with their 808s and I'm not 100% sure why. They'll turn up the hold all the way and they'll turn everything else all the way down. But at this point it's not actually an 808, this is more becoming a synth or a sub bass with this type of shape. Traditionally 808s have tails at the end of them and they sort of taper off. You guys can see if I drag a few other 808s into my project here. This one has a short little tail at the end here. This one over here has a little tail at the end as well. Same with this one. And so if I set my envelope setting to this perfect square, it doesn't have a tail. You guys can hear it if I play a note. It stops playing completely. And by all means, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with doing this. This type of shape can be perfect if this is what your beat needs. But at this point, it's no longer gonna have an 808 shape if you use this perfect square here. So to add that 808 tail, what you would do is increase the decay, the sustain, and most importantly, the release as well. And there you go, we have a nice short little punchy 808 here. But here is the annoying part. As many of you probably already do, it's really important to make sure you have the cut itself feature turned on. That way your 808s don't overlap. If you have multiple 808s playing on top of each other, they sort of cut each other off, which is nice. But for some reason, I have absolutely no idea why. Whenever you use the envelope function here, the cut itself feature will stop working for some reason. I'm not sure why FL Studio's like this. So with my 808 pattern, once I get to this section right here, typically what I'd want is these 808s to cut each other off, but it's gonna end up sounding like a mess. To make this even more pronounced, what I'll do is turn up the release. I'm gonna solo the 808 so you guys can hear what's happening. The tails of each of these 808 notes is bleeding into the next one, and we just end up getting this really huge mess of bass tones. And nothing in any of these settings in the 808 works. If I go and change this polyphony to 1, change it to mono, still nothing works. And you guys can see I still have cut itself enabled and it's still not cutting itself off. And so eventually I figured out how to solve this problem. Instead of dragging this 808 directly into your channel rack, what you want to do instead to have the best control of your 808 is open up Direct Wave, and then drag your 808 into Direct Wave instead. This is a plugin that comes with all versions of FL Studio. Not very many people use it, but it's perfect for 808s. And with Direct Wave, you can sort of think of it as a more advanced version of the Fruity wrapper that you're used to seeing here. It just has a ton more functionality that I'll show you guys right now. First things first, to solve this overlapping problem, what you're going to want to do is start off by going into the Program tab, and under the Play mode here, change Poly to Mono. From here, to make this 808 short and punchy like I had in the last example, I'd go into the Zone tab, and then turn up the Release Fader right here. And that's pretty much it. So if I go into my 808 pattern and I paste this into Direct Wave instead, you guys can hear what's going to happen now. The 808s actually cut each other off now. Also, another reason that you might want to use Direct Wave is it has some pretty good functionality outside of this feature here. If I were to grab a less distorted 808, for example, if I go back into the Program tab and I turn on the Drive, it has some pretty good distortion that you can add right into this thing. You can also go into the Sample tab here and begin to manipulate your 808 as well. For example, if I wanted to cut the beginning of this 808 here, go to Tools and then normalize this new 808. Now I'm using the tail of my last 808 to create my own 808 right here. This is something that I just found recently, and personally, whenever I use 808s in my beat, I'm probably going to reach for Direct Wave every single time now, just because it offers up so much more functionality and versatility. And those are the 3 808 tips that I wanted to share with you guys. If you guys have enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. Let me know in the comment section below if you have any 808 tips that you'd like to share. As always, my free drum kit is available to download, and the link to the Discord is down below as well if you want to participate in the live beat review. And I'll see you guys next time.